It's a pleasure and an honor to have Dr. Ayesha Imam deliver the Africa Day Lecture 2023 for TrustAfrica. Africa Day is a great day. We're celebrating the birth of the leading continental body we have, that's the African Union. Dr. Imam is a scholar, an activist, a feminist. She wears many hats. She just told us also how closely connected to TrustAfrica she is. She was there when they were creating it. She followed the developments, all the footsteps, accompanied them, and has always been present whenever we needed her. We are very, very proud to have you. Dr. Imam has published a lot as a scholar. She's taught in universities in Nigeria, in the UK, in Canada. She has mentored generations of activists and scholars. She has been a member of the executive committee of CODESRIA at a very early age and has been one of the people who transformed the social sciences of the continent by, pushing for the engendering, bringing in of gender perspectives, and in the process transforming the way we think, the way we do research, the way we understand issues on the continent, together with other great scholars like Professor Fatou Sow, Professor Ayesha Imam, Dr. Zainab Tadesse, and a number of them. So, and she was at the heart of that struggle, started institutions such as the CODESRIA Gender Institute that has inspired a lot of other initiatives of the same nature around. She has occupied many positions around, among the latest of which is that of having been the chair of the global board of Greenpeace. Greenpeace, known for the excellent work they're doing, to protect the environment globally. And so we are looking forward to hearing her talk to us about the issues that our continent need to be thinking about. And we see this Africa Day Lecture as an occasion, as a moment, an opportunity to get great African thinkers to help do what we really need today, and that is to push us to engage into audacious and original thinking about our own situation, our own problems, about ways of resolving the problems that our communities and the world of today are confronted with. And she has proposed as a topic for this talk, thrive, not merely survive, climate change with African people. I repeat, thrive, not merely survive, climate change with the African people, which is a whole program, right? Dr. Imam, the colleagues are listening to you, the community is listening to you, the world is listening to you. It's Africa's turn, so we're really very, very pleased to have you speak to us and to talk to these issues that around this issue of climate change and the need to thrive and not only survive. Thank you again.
Thank you, Bima. That was a very kind and generous introduction. And we and TrustAfrica and the colleagues at CODESRIA and Greenpeace International and others have been working on this together for many years. And hopefully we can all push it further in our various ways. And thank you all for being willing to come and listen and hopefully have a discussion about the issues that are raised. So, as Ibrima said, I would like to talk about how we, African people in the world, can thrive, not merely survive climate change. Global warming, human-induced, accelerated global warming, because there has always been climate change, but this particular period, we have human-induced through increased carbon emissions, through industrialization, basically. And it's warming the environment and it's having terrible effects. But we shouldn't forget that even before these recent impacts of the acceleration of climate change, the majority of African people were getting a bad deal. Not everything that's wrong is due to climate change. What climate change is doing is accelerating and exacerbating many of the systems that were already difficult, exploitative, harmful. Nonetheless, having to deal with climate change for survival, because as Kumi Naidu, who was the International Executive Director of Greenpeace International at one point, pointed out, the planet will still be here. What might not be here are the people and the people, the animals, the kinds of plants that we need to live with. So we do need to address climate change, both mitigation and adaptation for survival. But doing that also gives us an opportunity to shake up and transform the myriad systems that mutually interface with the physical ecosystem, the political, economic, social, cultural systems, including their relationships of privilege and marginalization, of exploitation and vulnerability. How we deal with climate change, what caused climate change, was not, quote unquote, a natural phenomenon in itself. It's how the physical world was interfaced and interacted with political systems, economic systems, social systems. And we know that people across the world continue, have done, under systems that abandon people in general and the sustainability of the planet in favor of power and profit, despite the growing movements of public support in so many different places to take the pandemic opportunity to build back better, equitably and sustainably. Elites, politicians, corporations have remained relentlessly attached to solidifying the status quo. The International Panel of Climate Change that brings together the scientific work of literally thousands of scientists across the globe have been direct and unequivocal about the effects of human economic activity on climate change, some of which is now irreversible. And yet, only 18% of government's global pandemic recovering spending went to preserving natural systems or accelerating clean energy transition. This is not nature. This is precisely how politics and economics and power and privilege play into how the environment is or is not sustainable and how people can or cannot live well within the environment. The systems and power structures that drive environmental destruction are the very same that increase inequality and leave people stranded, and they need to be transformed for simultaneously political, social, economic, and environmental sustainability and equity. I want to structure this discussion in three parts. I'll talk a little bit about climate change effects in Africa. Then I'll talk a bit about cause and responsibility. And then I'll talk a little bit about what we can do, we in Africa. It's clear that the deepening and widening impact of the climate crisis continue to rage unabated. In terms of temperature change, Africa's climate has warmed more than the global average, since pre-industrial times. And that increased temperature has contributed to a 34% reduction in agricultural productivity since 1961. That's more than 1/3 less than in 1961, more than any other region in the world. And this trend is expected to continue in the future. The increased temperatures, the variable rainfall, the disruption of long-known patterns of climate that farmers could rely on to know when to plant, when to harvest, when to weave, have all been interrupted. And that increases the risk of acute food insecurity and malnutrition, a global warming of 1.5%. And right now, despite the IPCC, we look to be on a track for more than 2% warming, but even 1.5% warming will be accompanied by a decline of 9% of the maize yield in West Africa and between 20 and 60% of the wheat yield in southern and northern Africa. Extreme weather events, rains, cyclones, flash floods, hurricanes are demonstrably on the increase, swept across Central African Republic, the DRC, Nigeria, Niger, Congo, Mozambique. Extreme rainfall events in 2022 alone claimed the lives of more than 600 people in Nigeria, more than 460 in South Africa. In fact, drought-related hazards have claimed the lives of over 500,000 people and led to economic losses of over $70 billion US dollars in the region. More than 1,000 flood-related disasters were reported as involving more than 20,000 deaths in Africa. So there will be more crop failures, more hunger, more insecurity. The World Food program has estimated that due to the worst drought in 40 years, 22 million people are at risk of starvation in the Horn of Africa alone. On top of that, we have global warming contributing to shrinking freshwater. The total surface area of Lake Chad shrank from 25,000 square kilometers in the 1960s to less than 1,500 in the 2000s. The long-term decline in river flow in West Africa is attributed to increase in temperature and to drought, as well as to increased water demand. Glaciers in equatorial East Africa, on Mount Kenya, Mount Kilimanjaro, and the Wenzori Mountains in Uganda, are retreating at faster rates than the global mean. We don't know if they'll come back. In parallel, the sea level rise along African coasts is faster than the global mean also, as in the extremely vulnerable Pacific Island nations. And that contributes to increases in the frequency and the severity of coastal flooding and erosion and salinity, increasing salt in low-lying areas. It has major impacts on the agricultural systems, on ecosystems, on biodiversity, and in fact, increasing loss of biodiversity, because we also have a biodiversity climate crisis, which is very closely tied with the climate crisis. As habitats change because of global warming, because of drought, it does mean that plants and animals are lost, with the possibility of medicine, food, and so on also being lost. And we should not also forget, apart from deaths and ill health and malnutrition, there's also a huge amount of displacement that results from global warming. Chronic floods and droughts, sea level rise, extreme weather events all influence displacement patterns, both within and across borders. It's been estimated that in 2021, around 14.1 million people were internally displaced in what's called sub-Saharan Africa, which is only one part of Africa, or maybe 2/3 of Africa. And that includes 11.5 million due to conflict and violence, but 2.5 million due to disasters. And all of these issues are exacerbated by the lack of or poor infrastructure to deal with them. It's what's called the inequities of effects, where countries and communities that are already vulnerable and lacking in power are more affected by the impact of climate change, whilst those who actually contribute most to climate disasters generally live safely and luxuriously cushioned. So that brings me on to cause and responsibility. If we look at the historic responsibility, we know that the acceleration of global change didn't really coincide, but was caused by the acceleration of industrialization and the increased carbon dioxide emissions that led to. For Africa, what it means is that the continued inequity and reinforcement of centuries of slavery and colonial and neo-colonial extraction simultaneously skewed the development of the global south, including Africa, and continues to rob it of resources. As you know, TrustAfrica itself has been involved in studying how it is that Africa continues to be net extracted of resources, whilst those same resources were and are used for science and technology, for infrastructure development and industry and carbon footprint emission in the global north. And it's not just history, those impacts continue today, as the AU and TrustAfrica study showed, not only, for example, in French colonial arrangements, whereby portions of formerly French colonies are still paying to France, but also in international trade terms, also in terms of trade and economy set by the global powers. One obvious example is the insistence that good economies must have free trade when the global north is strong, but their immediate recourse to the protectionism of their domestic economies the moment it's not, and which, through IMF and World Bank arrangements, have been denied to Africa and the rest of the global south for decades. So in climate change terms, the irony is that although Africa's resources, labor, and ingenuity were taken and used for industrial, technological, and infrastructural developments in North America and Europe, Africa as a region doesn't benefit from that. Even more ironically, the scale, impact, and effect of accelerated climate change are felt most in the regions that have contributed least to causing the problem: Africa, Asia, the small island states in the Pacific and Caribbean, South America. For example, today, Africa contributes just 3.8% of global warming, not even 4%. The US, the United States of America, is by far the largest historical emitter, responsible for 20% of all emissions. And the countries of the European Union are very close behind. We hear a lot about how China is the problem, but in fact, China falls to third when we take into account not merely today, but the historical emissions that caused the problem in the first place. It's about half of the US's total contribution. And when you consider it per capita, by people, it's considerably lower. And whilst the global North industrial development is exactly what caused accelerated climate change, the global North continues to refuse to accept its own culpability or what it owes to Africa and Asia and South America, having benefited and continuing to benefit, chooses not to take responsibility, nor is it willing to share beneficial technology, nor to make amends, but in many ways continues to try to maintain this stolen advantage. For example, governments continue to indulge the fossil fuel industries with taxpayer money in handouts from subsidies, tax incentives, bailouts, and the fossil fuel industries themselves continue to obfuscate the climate crisis and their role in exacerbating it, and to present false greenwashing solutions. For example, the insistence that the reduction of carbon emission targets should be set by state rather than by person is a way of locking in historical inequalities caused by colonialism, so that people who are living in the US, like myself, temporarily I hope, can continue to maintain comfortable, even lavish lifestyles with carbon emissions of 14.7 metric tons per person per year, whilst people in the Congo or Somalia or the Central African Republic, or even sub-Saharan Africa as a whole, live in hazardous and climate-vulnerable conditions, despite producing less than, in the case of Congo and Somalia and the Central African Republic, less than 0.1 metric tons per year, and in the case of Africa as a whole, 0.7 metric tons of carbon per year. Equitable targets for emissions reduction would have to set the target by people, by per capita, not by the political constructions that are states. It's clear that emissions do need to be cut back. It's clear that we need to move to clean energy everywhere, but it should be even more clear that the countries with high per capita emissions, who are also, coincidentally, the countries with responsibility for this mess, should cut back faster and should pay for the damage that they've done. The biggest polluters, who also have the highest standards of living already, must be the first and the swiftest to reduce, because the extent of global climate change impacts, including in Africa, can be greatly lessened only if fast and deep reductions are made to greenhouse global emissions in the main polluting regions of the world. The COP27, the Conference on Parties, last year delivered at least a ray of hope for climate justice. For the first time, wealthy countries agreed to a loss and damage fund to start addressing the devastating climate-related impacts in vulnerable countries, and that the countries and corporations most responsible for the climate crisis must make the biggest contributions. That is to say, they must actually provide, not merely promise, new and additional finance for what they call developing countries and climate vulnerable communities for loss and damage, but also for adaptation and mitigation. Nonetheless, as you and I know, the global North has a history of failed promises, especially of pledging money that never eventually is forthcoming. So, what to do? Africa, if only for its own self-worth and confidence, we have to pick up our own reins. More than that, whilst not absorbing the global Norths of all blame, we have to pick up our own narrative, our own story and understanding about history, economics, political, cultural, environment, has to be driven by Africans who center our own experiences, interests, and analyses for all African people. Let me give you one example. It's a nasty one, but it actually happened not very long ago. I was in a meeting discussing stopping fossil fuel extraction with climate justice. And a relatively young South African woman was talking about access to energy resources in the community and region that she works with in South Africa. And an older European man snorted and said, "The problem with Africa is corruption." I grant, we have a problem with corruption. But the fact that in a serious meeting, theoretically with allies, this could be said without an outcry from the majority of people there is simultaneously an example of both ageism and sexism, an older man slapping down a younger woman without, by the way, addressing the points that she had made. It's also of racism and superiority complex in knowing Africans better than the Africans themselves, who not only live there, but were also working on that same issue, academically and activistly. And it completely denies Europe's own role over the centuries through slavery to colonialism and neo-colonialism in continuing resource extraction, but also in breaking down the not perfect social relations and political relations that had existed prior to colonialism and slavery. So Western countries and Western allies need to completely redefine what they would like to consider their partnerships with Africa under the principles of reciprocity rather than extraction, and the principle of respect rather than condescension. And they're not going to do that on their own. They're not going to do that unless we draw the line whenever we encounter it. So that's one challenge. Because it doesn't at all mean that Africa has nothing to do. Everybody, everywhere, has to move to planet sustainable and people just paths and solutions. So I'm going to focus on three things that I think are key to being able to survive, but to go beyond surviving to thriving, despite climate change. One has to do with energy. Now, solar energy provides regions with the opportunity to boost their economies, to minimize their global carbon footprint and greenhouse emissions, to increase production and provide job opportunities, to provide clean power to people. Exploiting Africa's solar energy potential is a necessity. It's not just an opportunity, because as you all know, we have numerous electrical and power policy challenges. And yet Africa has roughly 40% of the globe's potential for solar power. And at this moment, it provides only 1.48% of the total global capacity for electricity generation. We have sunshine. We have the critical raw materials, cobalt, bauxite, platinum, and other materials. The solutions facing Africa in terms of climate change, energy demands, and electricity issues, but also environmental, health, and economic benefits and job increases would be huge. We've got large-scale potential. Morocco has already the world's largest solar plant. Possibly China is coming up now as well. Although sadly, Morocco's is planned to be exported to Europe. But there are also many small-scale modular solar power installations that are being installed across the continent at village, household, and individual entrepreneurial levels. There are successful mini-grid projects in Uganda, Ethiopia, Sierra Leone. In 2015, Sub-Saharan Africa was the leading region for purchases of off-grid solar products, particularly in Ghana, Nigeria, Senegal, as well as in Uganda, Rwanda, Madagascar, and Ethiopia. But we've got to make more direct attention to research, to scaling up, to building grids, most of our success so far had been in small off-grid areas. That doesn't help cities, and cities are where large proportions of our population are now. In policies that support renewable energies, in the implementations of programs for training, and that include gender awareness in development and access, both to policymaking, but also to implementation, to production, to distribution. We've seen what heavy fossil fuel-based industry does. We've seen it in the global north. We see it in the levels of pollution around the relatively few places where we already have heavy, large-scale industrialization in Africa. Should not be trying to follow that path. We know it doesn't work. It doesn't work for the climate. It doesn't work for the environment. And that heavy industrialization, profit-based, does not work for people. So we shouldn't be copying that either. Secondly, food sovereignty. This continent, Africa, which has around 60% of the world's unused arable land, does not feed itself. In the 1980s, under pressure from the colonial powers and the international financial institutions, many African governments abandoned supporting and developing local agriculture and food systems, and instead opened the door to imports and aid shipments of food, particularly cereals, and focused on cash cropping, raw materials cash cropping. And the result was that between 1980 and 2007, Africa's food production did not keep up with population growth, and its food deficit grew at an average of 3.4% per year. We went from a balance of agricultural exports and imports to a $22 million food deficit. And that's not the accelerating of food impacts on food of climate change. That is economic and political policy. But climate change is making the food situation worse. So it focuses us on needing to change that political and economic policy, because that was a focus on big business, capitalist corporations, and profit. It was our governments giving tax breaks, handing out lands and money, appropriating land from small-scale peasant farmers, setting up economic production zones and economic trade zones in the hope of attracting investment from business corporations. And it's clear it didn't work. We didn't get the investment, and we also didn't get development. And in the process, we neglected our own small-scale producers. Instead, we handed over corporate seeds and control of markets and prices. We reinforced or produced a need for industrially produced fertilizers, which not only leach and salt the land, and therefore require more and more fertilizer every year from the same corporate firms that produced it in the beginning, but which in their own production also increase carbon emissions. And we also produced in ourselves a huge need for water. We used to joke in Nigeria about what we called agric chickens compared to the local chickens that ran around and developed their muscles looking for their food. Agric chickens, we imported the eggs from Europe, we imported the feed from Europe, and we added water. That was it. So, food sovereignty is the right of peoples to sufficient, nutritious, healthy, and culturally accepted food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and allowing producers to have a right to define their own food and agriculture systems. I'm taking this from Grain, okay, and I can give people the references later. We have to move to food sovereignty. The fragility of Africa's food systems is immense. Look at there's a war in Ukraine. It's not even on the same continent. And then we have food security in Africa. We have to shift from talking about supplying food to developing our own resilient and ecologically sound food systems It's not just about food availability. It's about ensuring that the entire continental food value chain is robust and that it leaves no one and no community behind. And what it means is a profound transformation of the global food system from a model that favors the industrialized production of cheap commodities, agric maize or wheat, that are processed and shipped to Africa, to a model that's based on agroecological production and local food systems. In that sense, we're part of the way there already, because by and large, not everywhere, we already have small-scale farmers, fisher people, and pastoralists who have been continuing, in the face of increased pressure from governments and corporations and elites, to use agroecological methods to mitigate and build resilience. They're capable of doing more, but they do need, first of all, the stopping of undercutting what they're doing, that many of our governments and elites have been doing, access to sufficient and appropriate lands, support for developing water systems, fish stocks and seeds, with policies and programs that support them and that can ensure that food gets to where it's needed. Which would also cut down, by the way, on global emissions, because we would no longer, globally, be using up so much fossil fuel on transporting food across thousands and millions of miles. There are some examples of where this has already been done. Mali grew itself to be self-sufficient in rice production. So did Egypt. And that was through smallholder farms and a vast web of small traders and retailers in Mali, or in the case of Egypt, it's a state purchase and distribution system. And both governments in Mali and in Egypt regulated trade so that big business, international corporations were not able to set the agenda on rice policy. Food self-sufficiency, food sovereignty, can be achieved through government support of local production, and it's not being achieved through corporate agribusiness and international trade. And whilst we're there, I need to make the point, which I hope many of you will have thought of already, but often it isn't, that that includes women's access to land as a huge part of the producers already, but usually on marginal land and without control either of their own labour or of the products of that labour, and to better land and services. Basically, the climate crisis requires approaches to adaptation that support Africa's small-scale food systems and are led by Africa's small-scale food producers, not approaches that rely heavily on chemical inputs and seeds sold by multinational companies and produced by carbon emission increasing methods. And the third area that we need to pay attention to, but they are all interlinked, as I'm sure you can be seeing, solar pumps for water irrigation, for example. Third area is inequality, or more specifically, the economic, social, and gender-related systems of social relations, political relations, economic relations that produce inequality. And we can only do that through organizing and solidarity. We know that political, economic, military, and elites in Africa have lifestyles which are as luxurious and as carbon emission producing as the averages in the global north. Just as, to be fair, in the global north, not everybody in the global north has up to the average in the global north, and some have a lot more. And generally, who use up resources, producing carbon emissions that could give millions of other Africans electricity and health services and light and potable water, just as global north systems are doing regionally and globally. Internal elite marginalization systems are stealing from the majority of people in Africa. And if we don't face that, we can't move in solidarity and in strength altogether. One of those extremely pervasive systems of inequality and marginalization is along the lines of gender. And I'm sure you've heard me speaking about women's human rights many times, so I'll just summarize this. In Africa, as elsewhere, but I'm concerned with Africa, continued to be faced with violence, with lack of autonomy, with lack of control, with unequal opportunities, with lack of control over their own bodies, quite apart from the principles of human rights and equity and equality and justice, which are good enough reasons on their own. Can we really afford in Africa to waste half of our human potential in this way? Can we really afford to hamstring half of our potential, our population this way? And whilst I'm on the issue of gender, the amounts of time and energy that are being taken up with who is choosing to love whom and who is choosing to define their own bodies how is amazing, an amazing waste of time. Furthermore, it's taking up European patriarchal notions of gender at a time when, ironically, Europe and North America themselves are recognizing the absurdity of legislating who may love, live with, and define whom. And if anybody hasn't recognized it, I'm talking about the whole debate over whether people are or should be or can be lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, queer, intersexual, asexual, etc. This one ignores the fact that within Africa, there have been very many different ways of organizing gender. Until colonialism, it was not missionary style, man, woman, that's it. Yeah? But secondly, as long as you're not hurting anybody else, who cares? Why are we not putting that energy and creativity and fury into doing something about the actual problems that face Africa? Having enumerated some of the problems, let me point in a very, very small way to some, and there are many, many, many examples, but it is getting to time, of the changes that we might encourage and want to see more of. For example, responding to activist campaigns, the Gambia took a step to protect marine biodiversity and food security, to issue a stop notice to an externally funded fish meal corporation that was going to use local fish to grind into meal to feed pets in the global north instead of to feed people. So activists in South Africa managed to stop, through the Stop Shell campaign, drilling off the coast of South Africa. The Nyeleni Peasant Agroecology Manifesto, which was adopted by numerous national and regional African peasant and fisherfolk organizations in 2017, provides a clear path towards food sovereignty and climate resilience. And in different ways, many different social movements in Africa are trying to put that up, from struggles against corporate land grabs to fights against the entry of transnational supermarket chains, to fights to protect the local grain crops. We need that. We need more of that. We do have to recognize that the single most effective way to protect Africa, African food systems, and indeed the whole world from global warming is to cut global greenhouse gas emissions. However, given that Africa as a whole contributes less than 4% of total global emissions, that's obviously something that happens outside of Africa. But we have to go on making this point to the global north so that they and those who call themselves our allies in the global north have to pick it up and make it happen. That's their responsibility. But we can decouple. We can focus on making the best of the resources that we have and working with our people and putting our interests first. We can and must make changes within Africa to transform internally. We need to develop enough outrage and to harness the courage and creativity, the frustration, so that we focus it into talking and organizing and creative thinking to change the systems. We have to take matters into our own hands. We have to come together with the support of movements for climate justice, perhaps, to build and implement the visions of how we work, we have to recognize that there are struggles on many different fronts, but in the end, we're all facing in the same direction. So we have to make sure that the way that we're tackling climate change does not mean that Africa's food sovereignty goes down or women's rights are sacrificed. Victories, solidarity, community, work together are what gives us the energy to keep pushing for more of what African people and indeed the whole planet need, building power towards systemic change that is simultaneously socially and economically just and ecologically sustainable. Speaking for myself, one of the reasons that I like to keep in touch with TrustAfrica or with the literature is that every time one reads about even a small victory somewhere, it helps to strengthen us. As they say, if we put our hands together, the Hausa have a proverb, which means from many small raindrops, the river gets filled. Okay? So yeah, each of us can do a raindrop. Nobody can do everything, but we can do it if we do it together, if we channel it in the same way. We have to deal with climate change for survival. But recognizing that that also means we have to shake up and transform the myriad systems that mutually interface and interrelate with the physical ecosystems. That is, the political, economic, social, cultural systems, including their current relationships of privilege and marginalization, of exploitation and vulnerability, have to change, that we can and must do that. If we Africans work hard on transforming our internal energy to production to renewables, in transforming our own agricultural and distribution systems from food insufficiency and dependence to food sovereignty, and on transforming economic, social, and political relations away from marginalization and exploitation, but towards equity and solidarity, that gives us a chance to not merely survive climate change, but to thrive despite climate change. My fellow Africans, it's up to us. Thank you.